An innocent black girl is sentenced to life in prison for a crime she didn't commit. Her father, the U.S. Attorney General, believes in the system, convinced that justice will prevail. But as the truth unravels, he does the unthinkable. With no other choice, he does something no one saw coming, something that will shake the entire country. What does he uncover? And how far will he go to save her? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ava's pencil danced across the page of her sketchbook, bringing to life the delicate petals of a rose. Each careful stroke added depth and shadow, creating an image that seemed to breathe on the paper. The soft scratching sound was interrupted by an excited squeal from her best friend Kayla, who flopped onto Ava's bed, making the springs creak under her sudden weight. "Come on, Ava. You have to come to the party tonight. Everyone's going to be there." Kayla propped herself up on her elbows, her dark eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. She kicked her feet in the air like she used to do when they were kids. Ava didn't look up from her drawing, adding another gentle curve to a petal. "I don't know, Kay. Those parties aren't really my thing. But this is different. It's at Christopher Daniels' house. His parents are away, and his pool is amazing." Kayla rolled over and gently closed Ava's sketchbook, her perfectly manicured nails contrasting against the worn leather cover. "Plus, you got into Carleton Prep just like the rest of us. You belong there." Ava sighed, finally meeting her friend's eager gaze. She fiddled with her pencil, rolling it between her fingers. "That's exactly why I don't want to go. Some people there make it pretty clear that scholarship students don't really belong. Who cares what they think? I'll be right there with you the whole time." Kayla grabbed Ava's hands, squeezing them tight. "Please? Just this once?" After a moment's hesitation, Ava nodded, already feeling a knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Okay, fine. But just for a little while." 2 hours later, Ava stood in Christopher Daniels' massive living room, trying not to stare at the crystal chandelier that probably cost more than her mom's car. The bass from the speakers made the floor vibrate beneath her feet, and the air was thick with the smell of spilled beer and expensive perfume. The marble floors gleamed under the dim lights, reflecting the movement of dancing bodies like ripples in a pond. She stayed close to Kayla, who was chatting with some girls from their English class about the upcoming midterm paper. The party swirled around them, kids from school laughing too loudly, showing off designer clothes and passing around drinks in red cups. Every few minutes, someone would bump into Ava, spilling sticky drinks on the floor and mumbling half-hearted apologies. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence." Christopher Daniels appeared beside her, his words slightly slurred. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the smell of alcohol on his breath as he grabbed her arm, pulling her closer. "You know, you're pretty hot for a charity case." Ava's stomach turned as his hot breath hit her ear. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin. "Let go of me," she said firmly, trying to pull away. "Come on, don't be like that." His grip tightened, leaving red marks on her brown skin. "I'm paying for half your education. The least you could do is be nice to me." Anger flared in Ava's chest, hot and sudden. She yanked her arm free and shoved him back, hard enough that he stumbled into a nearby table. "Don't touch me." The music seemed to get quieter as heads turned their way, conversations dying mid-sentence. Jacob, Christopher's best friend, stepped forward with a sneer, his designer shoes squeaking on the wet floor. "What's wrong with you? You should be grateful he even noticed you, charity case." Heat rushed to Ava's face as whispers and snickers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Kayla appeared at her side, protective and worried. But Ava was already backing away, her heart pounding in her ears. "I'm leaving," she mumbled, turning toward the door. "Yeah, run away." Jacob's voice followed her, cutting through the resumed party noise. "Go back to where you belong." Ava burst out into the cool night air, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She started walking quickly, hugging herself against the chill, her thin jacket offering little protection. Behind her, she could hear Christopher's angry voice through an open window, and Jacob's lower tone responding, but she couldn't make out the words over the muffled bass of the music. She was halfway down the block when her phone buzzed. A text from Kayla asking if she was okay. Ava didn't respond. She just kept walking, her shoes scuffing against the perfectly maintained sidewalk, trying to shake off the humiliation of the night, not knowing that in just a few hours everything would change when Christopher's body would be found in Warren Park, with 3 stab wounds to his chest, his expensive clothes soaked in blood. Ava's feet ached as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her mind still replaying the humiliation from the party. The house was quiet. Her parents were probably asleep. She didn't bother changing out of her clothes, just kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her bed, pulling the comforter around her like a shield. Across town, red and blue lights pierced the darkness of Warren Park. Officer Thompson stood over Christopher Daniels' body, his flashlight beam illuminating the dark stains on the boy's expensive jacket. Detective Rivera crouched nearby, examining a bloody knife half hidden in the grass. "Got a witness," Officer Chen called out, leading over a stumbling man who reeked of cheap whiskey. "Says he was walking his dog when it happened." The man swayed on his feet, blinking against the harsh police lights. "Yeah, I saw that rich kid arguing with some black girl. She was real mad, pushing him and everything." "A black girl?" Detective Rivera pressed, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Can you describe her?" The witness squinted, his alcohol-addled brain struggling. "Young teenager, maybe? Had some fancy school uniform on?" "Like Carlton Prep?" Officer Thompson suggested, remembering the private school's distinctive plaid skirts. Yeah, that's it." The witness nodded eagerly, seeming more certain with each leading question. At 3 a.m., the peaceful silence of the Johnson household shattered. Heavy fists pounded against the front door, accompanied by shouts of, "Police! Open up!" Ava jerked awake, her heart racing. Footsteps thundered down the hallway, her parents rushing to answer the door. She slipped out of bed, creeping to her doorway just as voices erupted from below. "What is the meaning of this?" Her father's deep voice carried up the stairs, tight with controlled anger. "We have a warrant for Ava Johnson's arrest," a gruff voice responded. "Arrest?" Her mother's voice cracked. "She's 14 years old." Heavy boots stomped up the stairs. Ava backed away from her door, but it burst open before she could move far. 2 officers filled the doorway, their hands already reaching for her. "No, wait!" Ava tried to step back, but rough hands grabbed her arms. She struggled instinctively as they twisted her arms behind her back, cold metal biting into her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," one officer began reciting as they marched her down the stairs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Her mother's sobs filled the foyer. Her father stood in his pajamas, his usual commanding presence somehow diminished. "I demand to know the charges. You can't just—" "Your daughter is under arrest for the murder of Christopher Daniels," the lead officer cut him off. "Murder?" Ava's voice came out as a terrified whisper. The officers pushed her toward the door, ignoring her parents' protests. The night air hit her face as they led her to a waiting police car. Through tears, she saw her father running after them, his bare feet on the concrete driveway, his voice rising with authority. "I am the United States Attorney General. You will stop and explain yourselves immediately." But the officers didn't even pause. They pushed Ava into the back seat, slamming the door on her father's demands. Through the window, she watched him gesturing furiously, his words muffled by the glass. The car engine rumbled to life, and as they pulled away from her home, Ava realized that not even her father's position could stop what was happening. The interrogation room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the metal table where Ava sat. Her arms hugged her body against the biting cold, her Carlton Prep uniform offering little warmth against the room's chill. The clock on the wall ticked endlessly, marking hours without food, without water, without any human contact. Her stomach growled, a painful reminder of the party she'd left early, before the snacks had even been served. Her eyes fixed on the dark mirror that took up most of one wall. Someone was watching. She could feel it, like an itch between her shoulder blades. But no one came, leaving her alone with her rising panic. The door finally opened at 7 a.m., making her jump. 2 detectives strolled in like they were meeting for coffee, the casual swagger in their steps making her shrink further into herself. Detective Holloway, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair, dropped a manila folder on the table with a sharp slap. Detective Reese, shorter but broader with a face like weathered stone, leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Ava," Holloway said. Though his tone held no real apology, his lips curved in what might have been meant as a smile but looked more like a smirk. "Busy night." "I want my parents." Ava's voice came out smaller than she intended, barely more than a whisper in the stark room. Reese shrugged, the movement deliberately casual. "They've been notified. Now, let's talk about Christopher Daniels." "I didn't do anything," Ava said, her hands trembling in her lap as she twisted her school skirt between her fingers. "That's not what our witnesses say." Holloway opened the folder with theatrical slowness, pulling out a statement. "We have someone who saw you following Christopher into the park, arguing with him, said you looked pretty angry." "That's not true." Ava's voice cracked like thin ice. "I left the party early. I went straight home. I even texted my mom." "After he rejected you?" Reese pushed off the wall, moving closer with predatory grace. "Must have hurt, being turned down like that. Pretty girl like you, probably not used to hearing no." "What? No, he—" Ava's throat tightened like a vice. "He was the one who grabbed me. I pushed him away because—" "So you admit you got physical with him?" Holloway interrupted, scribbling furiously in his notebook, the scratch of his pen like nails on a chalkboard. "No, I mean yes, but not like that. He wouldn't leave me alone and I—" "Sounds like you led him on," Reese cut in, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Made him think he had a chance, then humiliated him in front of everyone. That's motive right there." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, blurring the harsh fluorescent lights into starbursts. "Please, I want my parents. I want a lawyer." The detectives exchanged knowing looks but continued as if she hadn't spoken, their practiced routine never missing a beat. "The knife had your fingerprints on it," Holloway lied smoothly, watching her face for any reaction. "That's impossible," Ava whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I never touched any knife. I've never even seen it." Hours blurred together in a nightmare carousel. They took turns, one playing good cop while the other pressed harder, their voices rising and falling like waves threatening to drown her. They twisted every word, turned every denial into an admission of guilt. The room got colder, or maybe it was just her fear. Ava's stomach cramped with hunger, her throat burned with thirst, her lips dry and cracking. Finally, at 1 p.m., the door burst open with enough force to rattle the mirror. Elijah Johnson strode in, his suit jacket flaring behind him like a cape, followed by Ava's mother, whose face was streaked with tears, and a sharp-faced woman carrying a briefcase, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "This interrogation is over," the woman announced, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm Margaret Chen, Ava's attorney. My client is a minor who's been held for hours without counsel or parental presence. This is a gross violation of her rights." But Elijah's eyes were fixed on his daughter's tear-stained face, the dark circles under her eyes like bruises, her trembling hands clutched in her lap. For the first time in his career as U.S. Attorney General, he saw the system from the other side, and it terrified him. "Daddy," Ava whispered, reaching for him with desperate hope. Detective Holloway stepped between them, his bulk casting a shadow over Ava. "I'm afraid it's too late for that. Ava Johnson, you're under arrest for the murder of Christopher Daniels." Elijah watched helplessly as they handcuffed his little girl, the metal clicking shut with a finality that echoed in his bones. They read her rights again with mechanical precision, words he'd heard thousands of times but never like this. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his carefully constructed belief in justice crumbling like sand as his daughter was led away like a common criminal, her school uniform a mockery of the innocent child she'd been just yesterday. Elijah Johnson's hands shook as he scrolled through the morning news on his tablet. His daughter's school photo, the one where she wore her favorite blue headband and smiled so brightly, was plastered everywhere. But it wasn't alone. Next to it was Christopher Daniels' photo. Blonde hair perfectly styled, white teeth gleaming in a practiced smile, his lacrosse uniform spotless. Breaking news: Black teen brutally murders star student. Honor student killed by scholarship student. Local teen's life cut short in savage attack. Each headline felt like a physical blow. Camille sat beside him at the kitchen table, her coffee growing cold and untouched. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications, social media exploding with hatred. "Look at her eyes," one comment read, "always knew she was trouble. These thugs don't belong in our schools. Lock her up and throw away the key." At the detention center, Ava stood barefoot on cold concrete, her arms wrapped around herself as a stern-faced officer barked instructions. "Face forward. Hold the number. Don't smile." The camera flashed, burning her image into yet another official record. Her fingerprints were rolled in black ink, pressed onto cards that would label her a criminal. The orange jumpsuit they gave her was too big, making her look even younger than her 14 years. "Move it, kid," a guard ordered, leading her down a long corridor of cells. The holding cell door clanged shut behind her with devastating finality. Adult women in identical orange suits stared at her, some with pity, others with something darker. Ava pressed herself into the corner, trying to become invisible. Across town, Elijah paced the courthouse hallway, his polished shoes clicking against marble floors he'd walked countless times before. Judge Matthews, a man he'd golfed with just last month, sat on the bench now, looking down at Ava's bail hearing with cold eyes. "Your Honor," Elijah's voice rang out, professional despite his inner turmoil. "My daughter has no prior record. She's an honor student. She has deep ties to this community." "Mr. Johnson," Judge Matthews interrupted, "I understand your position as both a father and our Attorney General. However, given the brutal nature of this crime..." He paused, glancing at where Richard Daniels, Christopher's father, sat with his army of lawyers. "Bail is denied." That night, Ava lay on the thin metal bed, the scratchy blanket doing little against the cell's chill. Voices echoed off concrete walls, crying, arguing, guards shouting. Every sound made her flinch. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she wouldn't let them fall. Not here, not where everyone could see. In his home office, Elijah stood at the window, staring at the news playing silently on his TV. His daughter's face appeared again and again, each time painted more monstrous by the media's brush. His hands gripped the windowsill until his knuckles went white. The system he'd defended his entire career, the one he'd built his life around, had turned on his little girl without hesitation. Rage and helplessness warred inside him as he watched another headline scroll across the screen. "Community demands justice for murdered teen." But there was no justice here, only power wearing justice's mask. The fluorescent lights in the holding cell never went dark. They buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls and creating an eerie, sickly glow that made everything look washed out and unreal. Ava lay rigid on her metal cot, the thin mattress doing nothing to soften its unyielding surface. Every muscle in her body screamed from tension and exhaustion, and her back ached from hours of trying to find a comfortable position. A guard's voice boomed down the corridor, echoing off the walls like thunder. "Lights out!" But the light stayed on, and the noise continued. Metal doors slamming with jarring force, distant arguments echoing, footsteps pacing back and forth in an endless rhythm. Someone 3 cells down was sobbing, the sound raw and desperate in the night air. Ava's fingers curled into tight fists, her nails digging into her palms until she felt the sharp bite of pain. The sensation helped her focus, helped her hold back the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not where everyone could see her weakness. Not where it could be used against her. Her orange jumpsuit felt scratchy against her skin, too big and too rough, like it had been washed 1,000 times with harsh detergent. The smell of industrial cleaner and sweat filled her nostrils, making her stomach turn slightly. Every time she closed her eyes, images flashed through her mind like a horrible slideshow. The party, Christopher's angry face twisted with rage, the police at her door with their hands on their weapons, her father's helpless expression as they drove her away in the patrol car. From across the cell, she felt eyes on her, watching, assessing. Her cellmate, a woman with hard eyes and tattoos crawling up her neck like dark vines, had been watching her for hours, barely blinking. Ava kept her gaze fixed on the ceiling, counting the water stains, pretending not to notice the scrutiny. "You don't belong here, kid," the woman finally muttered, her voice gravelly but not unkind. There was something almost maternal in her tone, despite its roughness. Ava's jaw clenched so tight it hurt. She didn't respond, didn't move a muscle. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore, not after everything that had happened. The woman might seem sympathetic now, but Ava had learned the hard way how quickly people could turn on her, how false kindness could be. The night dragged on endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. Ava's eyes burned with fatigue, but sleep felt impossible in this strange, hostile place. She squeezed them shut, trying to block out the harsh lights, the constant noise, the gnawing fear that threatened to consume her. Through the darkness behind her eyelids, she heard her cellmate's whispered words, soft but clear. They always lock up the wrong ones. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and bitter truth. Still, Ava remained silent, though something in her chest loosened slightly at the unexpected show of support, like a tiny crack in the wall of isolation surrounding her. Hours passed in a blur of discomfort and anxiety, marked only by the changing of guards and the occasional burst of activity in the corridor. The first gray light of dawn was barely visible through the tiny window, a thin stripe of hope in the darkness when purposeful footsteps approached their cell. A female guard appeared, keys jingling at her hip like a warning bell. "Time to go, Johnson," she announced, her voice professionally detached, as if she'd said these same words 1,000 times before. "Court date set." Ava's heart hammered against her ribs as she sat up slowly, her stiff muscles protesting every movement. As the guard opened the cell door with a loud, metallic clang, Ava glanced back at her cellmate. The woman met her eyes and gave a simple, firm nod, a silent message of strength and understanding that spoke louder than words. Days later, the courtroom buzzed with whispers and camera clicks as guards led Ava through the heavy wooden doors. The chains around her wrists and ankles clinked with each small step, forcing her to shuffle like an elderly person. The sound echoed through the packed room, making her face burn with shame. She could feel dozens of eyes following her every movement, some filled with pity, others with judgment. Her parents sat in the first row behind the defense table. Her mother's eyes were red and puffy, while her father's face was tight with barely controlled anger. His hands gripped the wooden barrier so hard his knuckles had turned white. Across the aisle, the Daniels family commanded attention like royalty. Mrs. Daniels dabbed at her eyes with a pristine white tissue, her shoulders shaking just enough for the cameras to capture her grief. Mr. Daniels stared straight ahead, his expensive suit and stern expression making him look like a statue carved from ice. The pearl necklace at his wife's throat caught the fluorescent lighting, drawing attention to her performance. The state prosecutor, Ms. Reynolds, stood tall in her crisp black suit. Her heels clicked against the floor as she approached the judge's bench, her voice dripping with false concern. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught her perfectly styled hair, creating a halo effect that felt mockingly out of place. "Your Honor, we have a troubled young woman before us today," she began, gesturing toward Ava. "A history of violence, including a suspension for fighting at school when she was 12. She emphasized the word violence as if describing a hardened criminal rather than a minor schoolyard incident. "Objection," Ava's public defender mumbled, not even bothering to stand up properly. "Relevance?" His voice was so quiet that even Ava had to strain to hear him. The judge barely glanced at him. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Reynolds." He waved his hand dismissively, already turning his attention back to the prosecutor. Ava watched in horror as her court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Peters, slumped back in his chair. His wrinkled suit and tired eyes matched his defeated attitude. He hadn't even met with her before the hearing to discuss her case. The coffee stain on his tie spoke volumes about his level of preparation. Ms. Reynolds held up an evidence bag containing the bloody knife, making sure to display it prominently for both the judge and the cameras. "Our forensics team found fingerprints near the murder weapon that match patterns consistent with the defendant's prints. The fluorescent lights glinted off the blade through the plastic." "That's impossible," Ava whispered to Mr. Peters, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I never touched that knife." The fear in her voice was palpable, but it fell on deaf ears. He shushed her without taking his eyes off his notepad where he was doodling circles instead of taking notes. The pen moved lazily across the paper, creating meaningless patterns while her future hung in the balance. Elijah's face darkened as he watched the public defender's lack of response. He leaned forward and whispered something to his own legal team, who quickly stood up. The movement carried the urgency his daughter's case deserved but wasn't receiving. "Your Honor," one of Elijah's attorneys said, "we'd like to revisit the matter of bail. Ms. Johnson has strong family ties to the community, no prior record." His voice carried the polish and confidence of a high-priced defense lawyer. "Denied." The judge cut him off, his gavel striking with finality. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "The defendant poses a clear danger to the community. She will remain in custody." The words hit Ava like a physical blow. She swayed slightly in her chair, the chains feeling heavier by the second. The metal seemed to bite deeper into her skin, a constant reminder of her new reality. "Trial is set for 6 months from today, October 15th, the judge announced, already gathering his papers as if eager to move on. The rustling of documents punctuated the heavy silence. A sob broke through the quiet courtroom. Ava turned to see her mother pressing a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Her shoulders shook with the effort to contain her grief. Next to her, Elijah's jaw clenched so tight that a muscle twitched in his cheek. His eyes darted between the judge, the prosecutor, and the Daniels family, understanding dawning in his expression. This wasn't justice being served. This was a coordinated attack against his daughter. The realization seemed to age him years in mere seconds, as the truth of their situation became crystal clear. The prison transport bus rumbled to life, its engine growling like a beast awakening. Ava stumbled down the narrow aisle, her shackles clanking with each step. Through the barred windows, camera flashes exploded like lightning, reporters jostling for the perfect shot of the teenage killer. The heavy doors slammed shut with a metallic thud that seemed to echo through her bones. As the bus pulled away from the courthouse, reality crashed over her like a wave. This wasn't some terrible dream she could wake up from. The cold metal against her wrists, the rough fabric of her jumpsuit, the stale air she breathed. It was all real. This was her life now. At the Juvenile Detention Center, a squat building surrounded by razor wire, Ava shuffled through processing. The guards spoke in bored voices, treating her like just another number to log. They took her fingerprints again, searched her roughly, and handed her a thin mattress, scratchy blanket, and standard-issue toiletries. The facility tried to look less threatening than an adult prison, with its beige walls and motivational posters, but the illusion was paper-thin. The air reeked of industrial cleaners and sweat, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made everything look sickly. Metal doors clanged in the distance, and voices echoed off the concrete walls. As a guard led her to her assigned cell, Ava felt eyes following her every move. A group of older girls lounged against the wall, sizing her up like predators studying prey. One of them, tall and intimidating with cornrows pulled tight against her scalp, stepped forward. This was Trina. Ava could tell by the way the other girls deferred to her. Well, Trina drawled, looking Ava up and down. "What's a little princess like you doing in here?" Her voice dripped with mock sweetness, but her eyes were cold and calculating. Ava kept her head down, remembering what her cellmate at the holding facility had told her. "Don't make eye contact. Don't engage." She shuffled past them, feeling their stares burning into her back. In her cell, a cramped space with concrete walls and a narrow window too high to see out of, Ava sat on the thin mattress. Her cellmate, a girl who looked about 16, didn't even acknowledge her presence. That was fine. Ava was learning the rules quickly. Don't speak unless spoken to, keep your head down, and never, ever show weakness. Night fell, bringing a different kind of darkness to the facility. As Ava lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, sudden shouts erupted from the cell next door. The sounds of a fight broke out, flesh hitting flesh, bodies slamming against walls, crying and cursing. Ava held her breath, waiting for guards to intervene. They never came. The fight eventually died down, leaving behind whimpers and heavy breathing. Ava turned onto her side, pressing her face into the thin pillow. "I didn't do this," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. "I didn't do this." But the words felt hollow in this place where innocence meant nothing. Meanwhile, Elijah Johnson's home office was a fortress of papers, legal documents, and case files scattered across every surface. The morning sun crept through the windows, casting long shadows across his exhausted face. He hadn't slept since Ava's hearing, his mind racing with connections and possibilities he'd overlooked. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten among the mounting evidence of corruption he'd uncovered. Camille stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, watching her husband with worried eyes. The usual grace and poise she carried had been replaced by a mother's raw fear. Her silk robe, normally pristine, was wrinkled from hours of anxious pacing. "You can't go to war with the system," she whispered, her voice trembling. "These people, they have power. They'll destroy everything we've worked for." Elijah looked up from his papers, his jaw set with determination. Dark circles ringed his eyes, but his gaze was sharp and focused. "They came for my daughter first," he said, his voice low and steady. "They've already started destroying everything." Throughout the morning, Elijah dug deeper into Judge McAllister's history. Each document revealed another layer of corruption. Case after case showed black defendants receiving maximum sentences for minor offenses, while white defendants walked free for similar crimes. The pattern was clear, but it was what he found next that made his blood run cold. His hands shook as he connected the dots, decades of legal training crystallizing into horrible clarity. Financial records showed McAllister held significant investments in Private Youth Corrections Corporation, a company that profited from keeping detention centers filled. The longer kids stayed locked up, the more money the judge made. It wasn't just racism, it was business. The thought made bile rise in his throat. By afternoon, Elijah had tracked down Marcus Lee, a quiet teenager who'd been at the party. They met in a small coffee shop away from prying eyes. Marcus kept looking over his shoulder, his hands shaking as he held his untouched drink. The boy's expensive sneakers and designer jacket couldn't hide his fear. "I saw Jacob that night," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was screaming at Christopher near the back door. They were fighting about something, but when I tried to tell the police, they wouldn't listen. Then someone came to my house, told me to keep my mouth shut." His words tumbled out faster now, like he'd been holding them in for too long. That evening, when Ava's call came through, the family gathered around the phone. Camille's hands trembled as she held the receiver. The living room felt too quiet, too empty without their daughter's presence. "Baby, we're fighting for you," Camille said, trying to keep her voice strong. "Just hold on. Your daddy's working so hard to bring you home." There was a long pause on the other end. When Ava finally spoke, her voice was different, flat, empty, like something inside her had already given up. "I don't think I can." The words fell like stones in the silent room. After the call ended, Elijah stood in his office, gripping the phone so tight his knuckles turned white. The sound of his daughter's hopeless voice echoed in his mind. The system he'd dedicated his life to defending had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Now, if that same system wouldn't save his daughter, he would have to tear it down himself. The thought should have terrified him, but instead, it filled him with a cold, clarifying purpose. The cafeteria buzzed with the clatter of plastic trays and restless chatter, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across worn tables. Ava stood in line, her orange jumpsuit hanging loose on her thin frame, making her feel even smaller than her 14 years. The smell of processed food made her stomach turn, but she hadn't eaten since yesterday, and hunger gnawed at her insides. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her tray, loaded with what passed for lunch. A pale sandwich with wilted lettuce, mushy vegetables that might have once been green beans, and milk that wasn't quite cold enough. Trina appeared beside her, tall and intimidating, her dark hair pulled back tight against her scalp. Without warning, she knocked the tray from Ava's hands with a swift, practiced motion. Food scattered across the grimy floor as other girls burst into cruel laughter, their voices echoing off the institutional walls. "Welcome to the jungle, rich girl," Trina sneered, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room like a whip crack. Ava's face burned hot with shame, the heat creeping down her neck. She stared at her spilled lunch, fighting back tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. The guards at the door didn't move. didn't even look her way, their faces masks of indifference. She bent down to clean up the mess, ignoring the snickers and whispered taunts around her. Later, in the concrete yard where girls were allowed their daily hour of fresh air, Trina and two other girls, one tall and lanky, the other short but muscular, cornered Ava against the chain-link fence. The autumn wind whipped around them, carrying dead leaves across the cracked pavement and whistling through the metal links. "You think you're better than us?" Trina shoved Ava hard against the fence, making the metal rattle. "With your fancy lawyer daddy? Think you're too good to even look at us?" Ava kept her eyes down, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to make herself smaller. She wouldn't fight. She couldn't afford another mark on her record, not when her appeal was pending. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, murdering butch." Trina's fist drove into Ava's stomach with crushing force, knocking the wind out of her lungs in a painful whoosh. Something snapped inside Ava, a dam of fear and frustration finally breaking. Her fist shot out before she could stop herself, connecting solidly with Trina's face. Blood spurted from Trina's nose, bright red against her brown skin. The yard erupted into chaos, girls forming a tight circle around them. Fists flew from all directions. Someone pulled Ava's hair so hard she felt strands tear from her scalp. She tasted copper penny blood in her mouth. Through the blur of violence, she saw the guards watching from their post, smirking and nudging each other, taking their time to respond to the fight. Only when Ava lay on the ground, blood dripping from her split lip onto the cold pavement, did they finally intervene. They roughly hauled her up by her arms, ignoring Trina completely, though she was the one who'd started it all. "Solitary for you, Johnson," one guard spat, dragging her toward the isolation cells, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. As they marched her down the dark corridor past rows of heavy metal doors, an elderly voice called out from one of the cells, warm and clear despite its age. "They break the ones who don't know how to fight. Don't let them break you, child. Stay strong." The guard shoved Ava into a tiny concrete cell, barely bigger than a closet, the walls covered in scratches from previous occupants. The door slammed shut with a hollow clang that seemed to echo in her bones, leaving her alone in the dim light filtering through a narrow window near the ceiling. She huddled in the corner, shivering in the damp chill. Her stomach ached from both hunger and Trina's punch. Her lip throbbed in time with her racing heart. But as she sat there, curled into herself, a sound drifted through the walls. Someone humming an old gospel song, the kind her grandmother used to sing on Sunday mornings. The melody was soft but clear, carrying strength and comfort in its gentle notes. It was the voice from before, the elderly woman. Without thinking, Ava found herself humming along, matching the tune note for note, letting the familiar rhythm wash over her. The simple act of joining in the song made her feel less alone, created a connection that transcended the concrete walls. For the first time since arriving in this horrible place, she felt a tiny spark of something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope, small but stubborn, like a flower growing through cracks in the pavement. Elijah Johnson straightened his tie as he strode into the sleek offices of Harrison and Mills, the law firm where he'd started his career 20 years ago. The familiar scent of leather and coffee filled the air, but today it brought him no comfort. The marble floors echoed beneath his determined footsteps as he made his way down the corridor. 3 people waited for him in the conference room. Private investigators he'd personally vetted and hired after weeks of careful research. "Thank you for coming," he said, sliding a thick manila folder onto the polished table. His hands lingered on the worn edges of the folder, where late nights of review had left their mark. "This isn't just another case. This is about my daughter." The lead investigator, Sarah Chen, nodded solemnly. "We understand, Mr. Johnson." Her reputation for thoroughness was what had drawn him to her team. "Find everything on Judge McAllister, the prosecution team, and especially the Daniels family. Every connection, every financial tie, every skeleton in their closets. I don't care how deep you have to dig." His voice carried the weight of a father's determination. Within hours, the team's findings began flooding Elijah's phone. Each notification made his heart race faster. Judge McAllister's sentencing records painted a disturbing picture. Black juveniles received sentences averaging 92% longer than their white counterparts for similar crimes. The data made Elijah's stomach turn as years of willful blindness fell away. That afternoon, he drove to the south side of town, parking outside a modest apartment complex where paint peeled from the walls and hope seemed as scarce as resources. Marcus Lee, the teenage witness from the party, lived here with his mother. When Marcus opened the door, his eyes went wide with recognition, fear evident in every line of his face. "Mr. Johnson?" Marcus's voice trembled. "You shouldn't be here." He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to materialize behind him. "We need to talk about what you saw that night, Marcus." The boy's shoulders hunched, making him look even younger than his 16 years. "I can't. They came to my house, said if I talked my family would suffer. My mom just got promoted at work and they said she'd lose everything." His words came out in a rushed whisper. Elijah placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder, feeling the boy's slight trembling. "I can protect your family, but I need you to be brave. My daughter's life depends on it." That evening, Elijah adjusted his bow tie in his car mirror before entering the Grand Plaza Hotel, its imposing facade a monument to old money and influence. The annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala was in full swing, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over the city's elite. He spotted William Daniels holding court near the bar, laughing with a group of admirers who hung on his every word. Elijah waited until Daniels stepped away for a fresh drink, the crowd parting before him like waves. "Your son's best friend, Jacob. He was arguing with Christopher that night, wasn't he?" Daniels didn't even turn around, his expensive suit a shield of privilege. "Mr. Johnson, enjoying the party?" "You framed my daughter." Now Daniels turned, swirling his scotch with practiced ease. His eyes were cold despite his smile, like a shark sizing up its prey. "Prove it," he said, taking a slow sip. Elijah's hands clenched at his sides as he walked away, anger burning in his chest. The realization hit him like ice water. Daniels wasn't worried because men like him built this system. They owned it. They controlled it. Every judge, every jury, every witness was just another piece on their chessboard. But Elijah wasn't backing down, not when Ava's freedom hung in the balance. His daughter's face floated in his mind, strengthening his resolve with each step he took. Sometime later, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Ava made her way through the cafeteria line, her body still aching from the fight. Her ribs throbbed with each step, and the cut on her lip stung when she moved her mouth. The other girls whispered and stared, but something had changed. They didn't see fear in her eyes anymore. Instead, they saw something that made them step back: determination. She found an empty table and sat down, picking at the bland mashed potatoes on her tray. The food was barely warm, and the gravy had already formed a skin on top. A shadow fell across her food, and she looked up to see an elderly black woman standing there, her gray hair pulled back in neat cornrows that framed a face that spoke of decades of wisdom. "Mind if I join you?" the woman asked, her voice warm but firm, like a teacher who expected to be heard. Without waiting for an answer, she sat down, her movements graceful despite her age. "I'm Ms. Lorraine. I heard you humming along to my gospel song in solitary." Ava nodded, studying the older woman's face. Deep lines marked her brown skin, carved by years of hardship and resilience, but her eyes sparkled with intelligence and strength that seemed to pierce right through to Ava's soul. "You got fire in you, child," Ms. Lorraine said, leaning forward, her plastic fork pausing midway to her mouth. "But fire without control burns everything. You ready to learn how to survive?" "Why do you want to help me?" Ava asked quietly, her fingers nervously tracing patterns in the mashed potatoes. Ms. Lorraine's eyes grew distant, focusing on something far beyond the prison walls. "I was younger than you when I first got arrested. Civil rights protest in '63. We were peaceful, but they said I attacked an officer." She shook her head, her voice heavy with old pain. "Been here 40 years because I won't say I'm guilty of something I didn't do." Ava's eyes widened, her fork clattering against the tray. 40 years. That's right. And I've learned every rule of this place, the real rules, not the ones they post on the walls. Ms. Lorraine gestured around the cafeteria, her weathered hand moving with purpose. Look there, see how that guard's watching the black girls but ignoring the white ones? That's not random. That's the first lesson. Ava watched as a white girl threw food across the room, earning only a mild settle down from the guard, who barely looked up from his phone. Minutes later, a black girl got yelled at just for standing up too quickly, the guard's hand instantly moving to his belt. The guards aren't here to protect you, Ms. Lorraine continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried weight. They're here to control you. And those gang girls who tried to beat you down? They don't want you dead. They want you scared. Want you feeling like you need them. Throughout the day, Ms. Lorraine showed Ava how to really see the prison. She pointed out how certain girls got bigger portions at meals, their trays heaped high while others went hungry. She explained how some got better work assignments in the library or office, while others were stuck scrubbing toilets. She demonstrated how the guards' random searches always seemed to target specific people, mostly girls of color, or those without powerful families on the outside. Your best weapon isn't your fists, Ms. Lorraine told her as they walked the yard, their feet crunching on the gravel path. It's your mind. Watch everything. Learn everyone's patterns. Know who's really in charge of what. That's how you stay alive in here. That night, Ava lay on her bunk, her mind processing everything she'd learned. The thin mattress crackled beneath her as she shifted, but for once, its discomfort didn't bother her. For the first time since her arrest, her thoughts weren't racing with fear and confusion. Ms. Lorraine's words had given her something she'd lost: understanding. The system wasn't just unfair, it was deliberately designed to break people like her. As she drifted off to sleep, no nightmares came to haunt her. The fear was still there, curled up in her chest, but it had transformed into something else: awareness. She didn't know how she'd get out yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let this place break her. Not now, not ever. The next day, Elijah Johnson woke to the sound of heavy footsteps and authoritative voices downstairs. His heart jumped as he recognized the familiar cadence of a federal raid, a sound he knew all too well from his years as U.S. Attorney General. Before he could even get dressed, FBI agents were already in his home office, rifling through his files, their latex gloves making soft, scratching sounds against the paper. "Mr. Johnson?" a stern-faced agent in a dark suit announced, holding up a warrant, his badge gleaming under the early morning light. "We're investigating allegations of abuse of power regarding your interference in a sealed juvenile case." Elijah's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his skin. "You mean my daughter's case?" Throughout the morning, he watched helplessly as they boxed up his files and computers, methodically stripping his office bare. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from former colleagues, people he'd worked with for years, shared meals with, trusted allies who were now suddenly unavailable, or sending carefully worded messages distancing themselves. Each notification felt like another small betrayal. In the kitchen, Camille grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear, her coffee forgotten and growing cold on the counter. "They're all turning on you, Elijah. If you keep pushing, they'll destroy us completely." Elijah looked at his wife, seeing the exhaustion etched on her face, the new worry lines around her eyes. "They already took our daughter," he said quietly, his voice heavy with determination. "What else do I have to lose?" Meanwhile, at the detention center, Ava felt the shift immediately. Guards who had previously ignored her now seemed to find fault with everything she did, their sneers barely concealed. During breakfast, her food tray came with portions so small they wouldn't feed a child. The meager servings spread thin across the plastic compartments. Random searches of her cell became daily occurrences, with guards tossing her few possessions around like trash, scattering her precious drawings across the floor. During yard time, Ms. Lorraine pulled her aside behind the basketball court, her weathered hands gentle but firm. "Your father's shaking the tree," she whispered, her eyes scanning for guards like a practiced sentinel. "They want you to break before he finds what he's looking for." That night, as Elijah sat in his darkened office staring at the few files the FBI hadn't taken, his phone rang, cutting through the heavy silence. The number was blocked. "Walk away, Johnson," a distorted voice crackled through the speaker, artificial and menacing. or your daughter won't make it to trial." The line went dead. Elijah stood in the darkness, his phone tight in his grip, knuckles white with tension. His eyes fell on the remaining file on his desk, documents proving Judge McAllister's connection to private prison companies and his history of discriminatory sentencing. The evidence he'd spent months gathering, each page a potential weapon. "Let's burn it all down," he muttered to himself, his fingers tracing the edge of the damning evidence, resolve hardening in his chest like steel. The morning light barely filtered through the narrow window of Ava's cell when she shifted on her thin mattress and felt something crinkle beneath her. Frowning, she slipped her hand under the mattress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her heart raced as she carefully opened it, reading the shaky handwriting. "They don't want you talking. Watch your back." Her fingers trembled as she refolded the note, tucking it safely into the hem of her prison uniform. She sat there for a moment, trying to steady her breathing while her mind raced through possibilities of who might have left the warning. During recreation time, Ava managed to find Ms. Lorraine in their usual spot behind the basketball court, away from prying eyes. The older woman's face was drawn with concern as she leaned close, her body positioned to block them from view of the guard tower. The familiar scent of industrial laundry soap clung to Ms. Lorraine's uniform, a smell that had become oddly comforting to Ava over the past months. "Listen carefully, child," Ms. Lorraine whispered, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "One of our sisters in solitary. She saw something. A guard was shredding papers late at night, papers with your name on them." Her voice was barely audible over the sound of basketballs bouncing nearby. A group of inmates walked past, laughing loudly, and Ms. Lorraine waited until they moved away before continuing. Ava's stomach clenched. "What kind of papers?" "Documents from your case file. They're hiding something, girl. Something big." Ms. Lorraine's weathered hands gripped Ava's arm, her fingers pressing urgently into the young girl's skin. "Keep your head down. Stay quiet. These people play dirty when they're scared." Her dark eyes held decades of hard-earned wisdom and pain. But Ava straightened her shoulders, a familiar determination settling over her. "No," she said firmly. "If they're working this hard to keep me quiet, then I must be close to something important." Her voice held a strength that made Ms. Lorraine's eyes fill with both pride and worry. The old woman recognized that fire. She'd seen it in herself once, long ago. Later that day, while folding laundry during her work detail, Ava met Maria, an inmate who'd been there for months. As they sorted through pillowcases, Maria showed her how the seams could be carefully opened and re-sewn, her practiced movements quick and precise. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they worked, providing cover for their whispered conversation. "Write your letter," Maria whispered, sliding Ava a stub of pencil beneath a stack of sheets. "Make it count. You might not get another chance." Her eyes darted nervously to the guard stationed by the door, but her hands never stopped moving through the laundry. That night, under her thin blanket, Ava wrote by the dim light filtering through her cell window. Her pencil moved quickly across the paper as she detailed everything: the guard's harassment, the shredded documents, the threatening note. She wrote about the unequal treatment, the missing food, the random searches. Every word was a piece of truth she needed her father to know. Her hand cramped, but she kept writing until she had filled both sides of the paper with her tiny, careful script. The distant sound of guards making their rounds kept her alert, ready to hide the evidence at a moment's notice. The next morning, Maria helped her slip the letter into a pillowcase seam, her skilled fingers making the stitches nearly invisible. They passed it to Jenny, a girl being released that day, who tucked it into her stack of outgoing laundry. Jenny's eyes met Ava's briefly, a silent promise passing between them. The weight of what they were doing hung heavy in the air, but none of them hesitated. Ava stood at her cell window, watching as Jenny walked through the gates to freedom, carrying with her the precious cargo of truth. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, whispering a silent prayer that her message would reach her father before it was too late. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison yard, and Ava felt a mix of hope and fear settle in her chest as she watched her words disappear beyond the fence. The distant sound of the gate clanging shut echoed through the corridors, marking the moment when her fate was truly out of her hands. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, hand-delivered by Jenny's mother, who understood the urgency of its contents. Elijah's hands trembled as he unfolded the carefully written pages, recognizing his daughter's neat handwriting immediately. The familiar loops and curves of her script made his heart ache. As he read about the guards' harassment, the missing food, and the suspicious document shredding, his jaw clenched tighter with each revelation. The paper crinkled beneath his tightening grip. "They're trying to silence her," he muttered, pressing his palms flat against his desk to steady himself. The morning sun streamed through his office windows, casting long shadows across the damning evidence he'd collected over the past weeks. Files and photographs spread across his desk told a story of corruption that went deeper than he'd ever imagined. 2 hours later, Elijah stood on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing before him like lightning. His dark suit absorbed the summer heat, but he didn't flinch. His voice carried across the crowd of reporters, strong and unwavering. "Today I present evidence of widespread corruption in our justice system," he announced, holding up a thick folder of documents that represented months of careful investigation. "Judge Robert McAllister, who denied my daughter bail and fast-tracked her case, has received over $2 million in kickbacks from private prison companies. These same companies profit from extending juvenile detention sentences." He paused, letting the journalists scribble frantically in their notebooks. The scratching of pens against paper filled the tense silence. "Furthermore, key evidence in my daughter's case was deliberately suppressed. A witness who saw another suspect arguing with Christopher Daniels was threatened into silence. And now, inside the juvenile detention center, guards are systematically destroying documents related to her case. They're erasing the paper trail of their own corruption." The crowd erupted with questions, microphones thrust toward him like weapons. Camera crews from major networks jostled for position, their equipment glinting in the harsh sunlight. Elijah continued, his voice rising with controlled anger. "My 14-year-old daughter is being starved, harassed, and threatened inside a facility meant to protect her. This isn't justice. This is corruption at its most heinous." Within hours, the story exploded across national news networks. Social media lit up with hashtags demanding justice for Ava. Public opinion began to shift as people saw the evidence of systematic corruption laid bare. Ordinary citizens expressed outrage at the treatment of a young girl, caught in a web of institutional greed. But by evening, Governor Harold Whitman held his own press conference from the state capitol. His face was red with barely contained anger as he denounced Elijah's claims, his jowls quivering with indignation. "These desperate lies from a father who can't accept his daughter's guilt are an attack on our justice system," he declared, straightening his expensive tie with manicured fingers. "Justice has already been served in this case. I will not order a retrial based on unfounded accusations and emotional manipulation." In his home office, Elijah watched the governor's statement on his laptop, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. The screen's blue light illuminated his face as he watched these powerful men close ranks, protecting their corrupt system at all costs. They weren't even trying to hide their allegiance to the Daniels family anymore. Their arrogance was as clear as their corruption. The television droned on with talking heads debating the case, but Elijah barely heard them. The government's message was clear. They would rather protect their own interests than admit to wrongfully imprisoning a young black girl. His eyes drifted to a framed photo of Ava on his desk, her smile bright and innocent from a time before all this began. The sight of her happiness only strengthened his resolve to fight harder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Ava stepped into the common area. Something felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the guards stood too still, their faces blank masks as they watched her. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, instinct screaming danger. The other inmates had gone unusually quiet, their normal chatter replaced by watchful silence. She saw Trina first, emerging from behind a table with 4 other girls. They moved like wolves, spreading out to cut off any escape route, their movements practiced and deliberate. Ava's eyes darted to the guards, but they were already backing away, leaving her exposed. One of them even smirked, checking his watch as if timing a scheduled event. The first hit came fast, Trina's fist connecting with Ava's jaw, snapping her head back with a sickening crack. Before she could recover, rough hands grabbed her arms, fingernails digging into her skin as they shoved her hard against a metal table. Pain exploded across her back, the edge of the table biting into her spine. She kicked out, catching one girl in the knee with a solid thud, but there were too many of them, their bodies pressing in like a suffocating wall. A boot slammed into her ribs, once, twice, 3 times. Ava tasted copper as blood filled her mouth, warm and metallic. She fought back wildly, scratching and punching wherever she could reach, but fists rained down on her from all directions. A storm of violence she couldn't escape. Someone grabbed her hair, tangling their fingers in her braids before slamming her face into the floor with brutal force. Through the haze of pain, she heard laughter. Not from the girls, but from the guards. Their voices echoed off the concrete walls, a chorus of cruel amusement at her suffering. Trina grabbed Ava's chin, her fingernails leaving crescents in the soft skin as she forced her to look up. "They told me to do this," she whispered, her breath hot against Ava's ear, carrying the scent of mint gum. "They want you quiet." Then she stepped back and kicked Ava in the stomach one final time, putting her whole body into the blow. The girls scattered like roaches when the lights come on, leaving Ava curled up on the cold floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. No one helped her up. No one called the nurse. The guards simply walked away, keys jingling at their belts like wind chimes announcing their indifference. Hours later, in the darkness of the cell block, Ms. Lorraine's voice rang out like thunder, bouncing off the metal bars and concrete walls. "She's a child, you monsters!" she shouted at the night guards, her words carrying years of righteous anger. "You watch grown girls beat a child and laugh about it? What kind of people are you?" The guard's response was cruel laughter echoing through the dimly lit corridor. "Shut up, old woman," one called back, his voice dripping with contempt. "Or you'll be next. We got plenty of girls who'd love to earn some extra privileges." In her cot, Ava lay still, each breath sending daggers through her chest, the thin mattress offering no comfort to her battered body. Her left eye was swollen shut, and she could feel dried blood crusted around her nose, flaking off whenever she moved. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing realization. They weren't trying to teach her a lesson or break her spirit. They wanted her dead, buried in paperwork as just another prison statistic. She stared into the darkness, listening to Ms. Lorraine's angry muttering from the next cell, the old woman's words a mixture of prayers and curses. The message was clear. Speak up, and next time would be worse. Stay quiet, or die. The choice was simple, but surviving it wouldn't be. Every breath was a reminder that her life hung by a thread, controlled by people who saw her as less than human. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elijah's desk as he stared at the photo in his trembling hands. The image was grainy, taken on what must have been a smuggled phone, but the violence it captured was crystal clear. His daughter's face, swollen and mottled with purple bruises, her left eye completely shut. A thin line of dried blood traced her split lip. His coffee went cold beside him, forgotten as rage and fear battled in his chest, making his stomach churn. He knew what he had to do. The system had failed Ava at every turn. Now it was time to work outside of it. His hand shaking slightly, Elijah picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd sworn never to use. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. Jackson Reed speaking. "Reed, it's Elijah Johnson. I need your help." His voice cracked on the last word. There was a long pause filled with static and unspoken history. "The Attorney General calling me? Must be desperate times." "They're trying to kill my daughter in there. I need something concrete, something they can't bury or ignore, something that forces their hand." Elijah's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. Jackson's voice softened slightly. "I heard about what happened to your girl. Give me 24 hours. True to his word, Jackson called back the next morning with a name. Detective Miles Carter. The cop had been part of Ava's arrest team, but quit days later, dropping off the grid before he could testify. His resignation letter had cited personal reasons, but the timing was suspicious. It took them 3 days to track Carter down to the Sunset Motel, a decrepit building on the outskirts of town. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, and the neon sign flickered weakly in the afternoon heat. The former detective looked nothing like his personnel photo. His face was gaunt, his eyes constantly darting around the room as he let them in. "I knew someone would come eventually," Carter said, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "They told me if I talked, I'd be next. But I can't sleep anymore. Can't live with what we did." His hands fidgeted with his collar, revealing dark sweat stains under his arms. "What exactly did you do?" Elijah asked, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Carter's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, taking 3 tries before the flame caught. "William Daniels paid us off. Big money to make sure his son's murder got pinned on someone else. Your daughter. She was just convenient. Black, smart, had an altercation with Christopher that night. Perfect scapegoat." He laughed bitterly. "They even had a backup plan if she didn't work out." "The evidence?" Elijah pressed, leaning forward in his chair. "The knife they said was the murder weapon?" "It was never tested for DNA. The real weapon disappeared that night. We had witness statements pointing to other suspects, all buried. The whole thing was rigged from the start." Carter's voice dropped to a whisper. "Daniels has half the department in his pocket." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes locked on Carter's face. "Will you testify? Tell the truth in court?" Carter took a long drag of his cigarette, staring out the grimy window at the empty parking lot below. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, broken only by distant traffic and the rattling of an old air conditioner. Finally, he turned back, his shoulders straightening. "Yeah, I'm done being scared. It's time someone told the truth." Elijah exhaled slowly, hope blooming in his chest for the first time in months. Here it was, the evidence they needed to blow Ava's case wide open. The key to her freedom was finally within reach. But he knew William Daniels wouldn't go down without a fight. The night was unusually quiet in the juvenile detention center when Ava jolted awake at 2 a.m. The familiar click of her cell door unlocking sent ice through her veins. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she sat up, squinting in the dim light. Guards never opened cells at night. Never. The silence felt thick and oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the ancient ventilation system. 2 shadowy figures slipped inside, their movements precise and purposeful. The weak fluorescent light from the hallway caught the glint of latex gloves on their hands. Their eyes were empty, devoid of emotion, like black holes in expressionless faces. In that moment, Ava knew with terrifying clarity, they weren't here to scare her. They were here to kill her. The first attacker lunged forward, fingers wrapping around her throat with crushing force. Ava's back slammed against the thin mattress, her lungs burning for air. The second figure moved to pin down her legs, pressing them into the hard metal frame of her bunk. Pure instinct took over. Ava thrashed wildly, her knee connecting with something solid. The second attacker stumbled backward, cursing under their breath, knocking over the small metal trash can with a clatter. Ava seized the moment, twisting her body and breaking free from the chokehold. She scrambled toward the open cell door, her throat raw as she screamed, "Help! Somebody help!" The sound echoed off the concrete walls, desperate and primal. But when she reached the doorway, her blood ran cold. 2 guards stood there, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with amused expressions. One of them even smirked, checking his watch as if timing a performance, his badge gleaming mockingly in the dim light. This wasn't random. This was planned, orchestrated with cruel precision. Just as the attackers reached for her again, Ms. Lorraine's voice thundered down the corridor, strong and clear. "There are cameras in this block, you fools." Her words carried the weight of someone who knew every inch of the prison's defenses. The attackers froze mid-motion. The guards' smiles vanished like smoke. Ms. Lorraine's words hung in the air like a shield. There would be no covering up a murder caught on camera. The silence that followed was deafening. The guards finally moved into action, pulling the attackers away and roughly grabbing Ava's arms. But instead of taking her to safety, they dragged her down the dark hallway toward solitary confinement, her bare feet scraping against the cold floor. They shoved her into the tiny concrete cell, her knees scraping against the floor, leaving angry red marks on her skin. Before the heavy door slammed shut, one guard leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "You're a dead girl walking." His whispered threat carried the certainty of a promise. The door clanged shut with finality, plunging Ava into complete darkness. She curled into herself on the cold floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her fingers gently touched her bruised throat as tears slid down her cheeks, each breath a painful reminder of how close she'd come to death. In the pitch black of solitary, reality hit her with crushing force. She was running out of time. If she didn't find a way out soon, she wouldn't survive to see another morning. The darkness pressed in around her like a living thing, threatening to swallow her whole. The next day, the morning sun cast long shadows across the dingy motel room where Elijah Johnson and Jackson Reed sat facing Detective Miles Carter. The former cop's hands trembled as he lit another cigarette, his fourth in the past hour. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chilly air, dripping down his temples and staining his wrinkled collar. The cheap vinyl chairs creaked under their weight as they leaned in, the faint smell of mildew and stale smoke hanging heavy in the air. "If I do this, I need full protection," Carter said, his voice rough from smoking. "Because they'll come for me. You don't know what they're capable of." His bloodshot eyes darted between them, searching their faces for any sign of doubt. Jackson leaned forward, his expression serious, eyes locked on Carter's face. "We've already arranged a safe house and round-the-clock security. You'll be protected the moment you step in front of those cameras. My team doesn't make mistakes." He pulled out a folder showing Carter the detailed security arrangements. Carter took a long drag, exhaling slowly, the smoke curling in the stale air between them. "The Daniels family, they paid Chief Robertson $500,000 to pin this on your daughter." His words came out in a rush, like he couldn't hold them back anymore, years of guilt finally breaking free. "The knife we found? Jacob Daniels' fingerprints were all over it, but we were ordered to lose it. There was security footage, too, showing Christopher and Jacob in a heated argument minutes before the murder. All of it, gone. Wiped clean like it never existed." His fingers drummed nervously against his thigh as he spoke. Elijah's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady, years of courtroom experience helping him maintain his composure. "And you're willing to say all this on camera?" His hands were folded tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. Carter nodded, crushing his cigarette into an overflowing ashtray with shaking fingers. "I'm done being their puppet. I've lost too much sleep over this already." The dark circles under his eyes testified to his words. 2 hours later, Carter sat under the bright lights of the Channel 7 news studio, makeup barely concealing his exhaustion. His face was ashen, but his voice remained clear as he detailed the corruption. Millions watched live as he described how evidence was destroyed, witnesses were threatened, and an innocent girl was framed for murder. The tension in the studio was palpable as each revelation landed like a bomb. Behind the cameras, producers whispered urgently into their headsets, knowing they were broadcasting something explosive. "I helped destroy a child's life," Carter confessed, looking directly into the camera, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't live with that anymore. The nightmares have to stop." His voice cracked on the last word, raw emotion bleeding through. Social media exploded within minutes, the digital wildfire spreading faster than anyone could control. Free Ava Johnson shot to the top of trending topics. Justice for Ava followed close behind. Videos of Carter's confession were shared millions of times, accompanied by outraged comments demanding action. The internet's collective fury was impossible to ignore. News anchors across the country interrupted their regular programming to cover the breaking story. Governor Whitman called an emergency press conference, his usual polished demeanor showing cracks of strain. "Detective Carter's accusations are baseless lies from a disgraced officer," he declared, gripping the podium tightly, his knuckles white with tension. "Justice was already served in this case. This is nothing but attention-seeking behavior." Sweat gathered at his hairline as reporters shouted questions he couldn't answer. But in his private office, William Daniels paced frantically, phone pressed to his ear, his perfectly tailored suit now rumpled from hours of anxiety. "Fix this," he shouted into the receiver, spittle flying from his lips. "I don't care what it costs." His hand shook as he watched the social media storm grow, refresh after refresh showing only worse numbers. The truth was out, and for the first time, people were listening. His carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to collapse. Empty whiskey glasses littered his desk, evidence of his growing desperation as his control slipped away. The doorbell rang just as Elijah and Camille were finishing dinner, the last bites of food turning tasteless in their mouths. Through the peephole, they saw no one, just a small brown package on their doorstep, innocent-looking but somehow menacing in the fading evening light. Camille's hands trembled as she picked it up, the package lightweight but ominous in its plainness, the brown paper wrapping unmarked except for their address in block letters, the strokes harsh and deliberate. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, lay a single brass bullet, its metal surface gleaming with deadly promise under their dining room light. A handwritten note accompanied it. "Drop the case, or your daughter dies." The paper slipped from Camille's fingers as she stumbled backward, her face draining of color, her shoulders sagging against the wall for support. The room spun around her as the implications sank in. Elijah immediately called Jackson Reed, who arrived within 20 minutes, his weathered face grim as he examined the bullet under the bright kitchen lights, turning it over and over like a deadly puzzle piece. "This isn't an empty threat," Jackson said, turning the bullet over in his gloved hands, studying every detail with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too much. "Daniels has connections everywhere. Corrupt cops, prison guards, even hired killers. We need to move Ava now before they can touch her. Every minute counts. These people don't make mistakes, and they don't leave witnesses." Elijah paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor, each step echoing like a countdown. "The whole country is watching. If we back down now, they'll never face justice." His voice cracked with frustration, exhaustion evident in every word, the weight of impossible choices crushing down on him. "But if we keep pushing, they'll kill her," Jackson finished bluntly, his eyes hard with certainty, years of FBI experience backing every word. "And make it look like an accident. Clean, simple, untraceable. They've done it before and they'll do it again." Meanwhile, in the cold darkness of solitary confinement, Ava pressed her ear against the concrete wall, straining to hear the guards' conversation outside her cell. Their voices drifted through, casual and cruel, like they were discussing the weather rather than someone's life. The chill of the concrete seeped into her skin, but she didn't dare move. "Won't be long now," one guard muttered, followed by the sound of keys jingling against metal bars, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her nightmares. "Orders came down today." Another guard laughed, the sound echoing in the empty corridor, bouncing off the walls like a twisted melody that made Ava's skin crawl. "Bet it looks like suicide. These troubled teens, you know how it is. Nobody'll question it too hard, just another sad story." Ava's heart pounded against her ribs as she processed their words, each beat a reminder of her mortality. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness growing thicker, more threatening, like a living thing ready to swallow her whole. She could almost feel its cold fingers reaching for her throat. Later that night, during meal delivery, a small piece of paper slipped under her tray, nearly invisible against the metal surface. Ms. Lorraine's familiar handwriting was barely visible in the dim light. The words scratched hurriedly but clear, each letter carrying the weight of desperate urgency. "Stay awake. Trust no one, not even the guards who seem kind. Your life depends on it." Sitting cross-legged on her thin mattress, Ava wrapped her arms around herself, fighting against the crushing weight of fear that threatened to paralyze her. Their plan became crystal clear. They would kill her and stage it as a suicide. Another tragic statistic in the system. Another young black life dismissed and forgotten. Her fingers curled into fists as rage mixed with terror, her nails digging half-moons into her palms until tiny crescents of pain grounded her in reality. She wouldn't let them win. She couldn't. But in the suffocating darkness of solitary, with guards watching her every move and death lurking in every shadow, how could she fight back against an enemy that controlled her every breath? The night stretched endlessly ahead, each minute a battle to stay alert, stay alive, stay one step ahead of those who wanted her silenced forever. The forensic analyst's hands trembled slightly as she handed Elijah the sealed envelope. Inside were the DNA test results that had been buried, hidden from the court and the public. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the most respected forensic experts in the country, had personally run the tests 3 times to be absolutely certain. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "This proves she didn't do it. The blood patterns, the DNA markers, they all point to Jacob Daniels, not your daughter." Elijah stared at the papers, his vision blurring as he processed the implications. Scientific proof of what he'd known all along. His daughter was innocent, and the real killer had been protected by a corrupt system. Hours later, under the harsh studio lights of CNN's primetime slot, Elijah sat across from veteran anchor Michael Torres. The DNA results lay on the table between them, each page a bullet in Elijah's arsenal of truth. "These test results," Elijah said, his voice carrying the weight of months of struggle, "prove conclusively that the blood on the murder weapon belongs to Jacob Daniels, not my daughter. The system didn't just fail. It actively worked to imprison an innocent child while protecting the real killer." Social media exploded within minutes. The hashtag #Free Ava Johnson shot to #1 worldwide. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, their headlines screaming about corruption and injustice, but the system fought back hard. Warden Patricia Mills held a press conference outside the Juvenile Detention Center, her face stern as she declared, "We cannot release an inmate based on unverified claims, regardless of media attention." William Daniels, surrounded by expensive lawyers in his company's boardroom, dismissed the evidence entirely. These so-called tests were clearly manipulated by a desperate father trying to free his guilty daughter, he announced, his voice dripping with practiced concern. Governor Whitman took it even further. In an emergency address from the state capitol, he stood at the podium, red-faced, and pointing his finger at the cameras. "Elijah Johnson has crossed a line. He's not just attacking our justice system, he's inciting violence against our institutions. This kind of domestic terrorism cannot stand." Outside the courthouse, the streets filled with protesters. They carried signs bearing Ava's face and chanted her name in rhythmic waves that echoed off the building's stone facade. "Free Ava! Free Ava!" Their voices grew louder with each passing minute as more people joined the crowd. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the scene to millions. Reporters stood at the edges of the crowd, describing the historic moment to their viewers. Social justice activists live-streamed from within the protest, showing the world how peaceful citizens were standing up against corruption. Elijah watched from the courthouse steps, surrounded by his legal team. The evidence was irrefutable. The public was finally seeing the truth. But he could see the desperate fury in the eyes of the powerful men who had orchestrated this injustice. They weren't done fighting, not by a long shot. The fluorescent lights flickered in the Juvenile Detention Center's common area as inmates gathered around the small television mounted high on the wall. Ava sat quietly in the back, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat as she watched her father on CNN, holding up the DNA test results that proved her innocence. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she could barely breathe. "Breaking news," the anchor announced, her professional composure masking any emotion. "New evidence suggests 14-year-old Ava Johnson was wrongfully convicted in the Christopher Daniels murder case. Lab results indicate a complete mismatch with evidence found at the crime scene." The room erupted in a mix of reactions. Some girls cheered, pumping their fists in the air and shouting words of triumph. Others watched in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the shock of seeing justice actually work for once. A few inmates who had gotten to know Ava over the past weeks patted her on the back, whispering words of congratulation and squeezing her shoulders supportively. But the celebration was short-lived. Within minutes, guards stormed into the common area, their boots thundering against the linoleum floor. Officer Reynolds, a stocky woman with cold eyes and thin lips pressed into a harsh line, switched off the television with savage force. "Everyone back to their cells now," she barked, her hand resting meaningfully on her baton. When the inmates protested, demanding to see more news, the guards grew aggressive. They started shoving girls toward the exits, their movements rough and purposeful. The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band pulled too tight, releasing months of pent-up frustration and rage. "You can't shut us up!" someone shouted from the back of the room. Suddenly, plastic chairs went flying through the air like missiles. Tables flipped over with thunderous crashes. Girls who had been quiet for months finally unleashed their anger, screaming about justice and abuse, their voices raw with emotion. The guards responded with force, pulling out their batons with practiced efficiency. The sound of impact and screams filled the air, creating a horrible symphony of pain and protest. Through the chaos, Ms. Lorraine grabbed Ava's arm with surprising strength and pulled her into a corner behind an overturned table. "Listen to me carefully, child," the older woman whispered urgently, her weathered face inches from Ava's. "They're losing control, and that makes them dangerous. Like wounded animals ready to strike. They've got nothing left to lose now." Ava nodded, understanding the warning in Ms. Lorraine's eyes. As they huddled in their corner, Trina approached them, limping slightly from the chaos. Her face was different now, softer, almost apologetic, with none of the usual hardness. The girl who had once tried to break Ava's spirit now looked at her with something like respect, maybe even admiration. "I was wrong about you," Trina said quietly, her eyes darting to make sure no guards were within earshot. She wiped blood from a small cut on her lip. "If you make it out, make it count. Show them what we've been saying all along." The prison's warning sirens began to wail, their shrill sound drowning out everything else like a banshee's cry. Guards shouted orders through megaphones, demanding everyone return to their cells immediately, their voices cracking with barely controlled panic. Metal doors slammed shut throughout the facility with finality, each crash echoing through the corridors. Ava watched as the guards' faces twisted with barely contained rage, their eyes glinting with dangerous intent. They knew that if she walked free, their abuse would be exposed. Their careers, their freedom, everything would be at risk. The realization hit her hard, settling like ice in her stomach. They would rather watch the whole place descend into chaos than let her leave alive. These weren't just guards anymore. They were cornered predators with everything to lose. Elijah's phone buzzed on his desk at 2 a.m., jolting him from a restless sleep over case files and legal documents scattered across his mahogany desk. Jackson Reed's name flashed on the screen, the bright light harsh in the darkness of his office. "They just put a hit out on your daughter," Jackson's voice crackled through the speaker, tight with urgency. "My contact inside the governor's office just confirmed it. They're moving fast on this one." Elijah's blood ran cold, his fingers gripping the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "What exactly did they say?" "It's bad, Elijah, real bad." Jackson took a shaky breath, the sound of shuffling papers in the background. "A high-ranking official from Whitman's office gave the order. They want Ava removed before she can be released. They're planning to make it look like suicide. They've even got someone on the inside ready to plant evidence." Camille, who had been dozing on the worn leather office couch, sat up straight at the fear in her husband's voice. She watched as Elijah's hands began to shake, his usually composed demeanor crumbling. Without wasting a second, Elijah dialed the juvenile detention center's warden, his heart pounding against his ribs. After 3 agonizing rings, Warden Matthews picked up. "My daughter needs protection," Elijah demanded, his voice hard as steel. "I know about the hit. If anything happens to her—" "You've got the wrong number," Matthews interrupted, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. The line went dead with a decisive click. Elijah slammed his fist on the desk, making papers scatter across the floor like autumn leaves. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. His fingers flew over his phone's keypad as he sent rapid-fire messages to every contact he had at the National Civil Rights Lawyers Association, calling in every favor he'd earned over his decades-long career. Then he called Rachel Martinez, a reporter he trusted at the Washington Post, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm sending you evidence of a death threat against my daughter," he said. "I need this story everywhere in the next hour. Make it impossible for them to hide." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, Shaka Protectava began trending on Twitter, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. News alerts lit up phones across the country, their urgent pings echoing through millions of homes. Video clips of Elijah's CNN appearance showing the DNA evidence played on repeat on every major network. The truth impossible to ignore. The public outrage was deafening, a tidal wave of anger and demands for justice. Celebrities tweeted their support, their millions of followers amplifying the message. Civil rights leaders demanded immediate action, organizing emergency protests outside government buildings. Politicians who had stayed silent suddenly found their voices, calling for investigations and reform. At 4:30 a.m., Governor Whitman's office released an emergency statement. The governor, looking haggard and defeated on camera, his tie askew and forehead gleaming with nervous sweat, announced an emergency court hearing to review Ava's case and consider immediate release. Elijah sat in his dark office, still gripping his phone like a lifeline, watching the city lights twinkle through his window. The sun would rise in a few hours, painting the sky in shades of hope. If Ava could just make it through the night, she might finally walk free. But until then, every minute felt like an eternity, and he couldn't shake the terror that they might still be too late, that the shadows lurking in the system might reach her before justice could. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick concrete walls of Ava's cell when she heard the soft click of her door unlocking. A young guard she'd never seen before slipped inside, his face tense with urgency. "They're coming for you," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "If you want to live, we have to move. Now." Ava hesitated, her heart racing. Ms. Lorraine had warned her to trust no one, but something in the guard's eyes spoke of genuine fear. He reached for her arm with trembling hands. "I've seen what they do here," he said softly. "I can't watch them kill another innocent kid." They moved silently through the dim corridors, the guard leading her through service passages she didn't know existed. The laundry room's industrial machines hummed loudly, masking their footsteps. Steam filled the air, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But before they could reach the service exit, fluorescent lights suddenly flooded the room. "Going somewhere?" a familiar voice drawled. 3 guards emerged from the shadows, led by Officer Martinez, his face twisted in a cruel smile. Rough hands grabbed Ava, dragging her back through the corridors. She caught glimpses of other inmates watching through their cell windows, their faces filled with helpless anger. The young guard who tried to help her was led away in handcuffs. The warden stood waiting outside her cell, his expensive suit out of place in the grimy prison hallway. "You really thought you were leaving?" he smirked, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "How naive." Meanwhile, at the courthouse across town, Elijah stood before Judge Sarah Martinez, his voice steady as he presented the DNA evidence that would exonerate his daughter. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The judge's hands trembled slightly as she examined the evidence. Her face showed the weight of her position. This wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about exposing decades of systematic corruption, about challenging a system built on prejudice and profit. Back in the prison, Ms. Lorraine managed to reach Ava just before the transport officers arrived. The older woman's weathered hands gripped Ava's with surprising strength. "No matter what happens," Ms. Lorraine said fiercely, her eyes burning with determination, "you keep fighting. You hear me, child?" Ava nodded, fighting back tears as the guards approached with shackles. The drive to the courthouse felt surreal. Through the transport van's tiny windows, Ava could see crowds lining the streets. People held signs reading, "Free Ava Johnson" and "Black Lives Matter." Their voices rose in unified chants of her name, the sound penetrating even the thick metal walls of the vehicle. The heavy guard escort moved her through back entrances, trying to avoid the massive crowd gathered at the courthouse steps. News helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating a steady rhythm against the morning sky. Inside the building, Ava could feel the weight of the moment. The entire nation was watching, waiting to see if justice would finally prevail. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Ava was led in, her orange jumpsuit bright against the dark wood paneling. Her wrists and ankles clinked with each step, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet room like a grim reminder of her imprisonment. Her mother, Camille, sat in the front row, tears streaming silently down her face, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Next to her, Elijah's jaw was tight, his eyes never leaving his daughter, his normally composed demeanor barely containing his rage at seeing his child in chains. Across the aisle, William Daniels glared at Ava with undisguised hatred, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the chains binding the 14-year-old girl. His manicured fingers drummed impatiently on the wooden barrier before him. Governor Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat nearby, aware that his political career hung by a thread, beads of sweat visible on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning. Elijah rose to deliver his final argument, his voice steady and clear, carrying the weight of months of investigation and sleepless nights. Your Honor, what we have uncovered isn't just a miscarriage of justice, it's a calculated conspiracy. He methodically laid out each piece of evidence: the fabricated DNA results, the suppressed witness statements, the intimidation of Detective Carter. His practiced hands gestured with precise movements, each point landing like a hammer blow. And most damning of all, Elijah continued, holding up the real DNA report, its pages crisp and damning, is this proof that Jacob Daniels' blood was on the murder weapon, not my daughter's. Jacob Daniels killed Christopher and powerful men covered it up. His words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. The prosecution scrambled to their feet, papers rustling in their haste. Your Honor, the system worked as intended. Due process was followed. If the system worked, Elijah cut in, his voice sharp with controlled anger, my daughter wouldn't be in chains today. The truth of his words seemed to ripple through the courtroom. Jackson Reed took the stand next, his testimony precise and devastating. His eyes never wavered as he detailed how evidence was destroyed, witnesses threatened, and an innocent girl framed. Detective Carter followed, his hands shaking as he confirmed every word, his voice growing stronger with each admission of corruption. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs, the sound swelling like a wave. William Daniels' face turned purple with rage, his expensive collar suddenly seeming too tight. The governor stared at his shoes, his political ambitions crumbling before his eyes. Judge Martinez called for order, her gavel cracking against wood like a gunshot. The room fell silent, every breath held in anticipation. She looked directly at Ava, studying her face for a long moment, seeing not a criminal but a child who had endured too much. When she spoke, her voice was clear and firm, carrying the weight of justice finally served. Case dismissed. Ava Johnson, you are free. The courtroom exploded in cheers, the sound of justice breaking through months of darkness. A bailiff stepped forward, unlocking Ava's shackles. They fell away with a final clank, the sound of liberation echoing off the walls, and Ava stumbled forward into her mother's waiting arms. Camille held her tight, both of them sobbing as Elijah wrapped his arms around them both, their family whole again at last. The courthouse doors swung open and sunlight hit Ava's face for the first time in 2 years without metal bars filtering it. The roar of the crowd hit her like a physical wave, hundreds of voices rising in unison, chanting her name, celebrating her freedom. Signs bobbed above the sea of faces. Justice for Ava. Black Lives Matter. System change now. The autumn air felt crisp and clean in her lungs, so different from the stale prison atmosphere she'd grown accustomed to. Ava stood frozen at the top of the courthouse steps, her prison uniform feeling suddenly alien in the bright daylight. Her legs trembled, unused to so much space, so much freedom. Camille and Elijah flanked her, their hands steady on her shoulders as camera flashes exploded around them like lightning. The concrete beneath her feet felt strange, too smooth, too wide open compared to her tiny cell. Baby, you're safe now, Camille whispered, pulling Ava into a fierce embrace. Elijah wrapped his arms around them both, his tears falling freely now that the battle was won. The family clung to each other as the crowd's cheers washed over them, their private moment of joy witnessed by hundreds. Ava breathed in her mother's familiar perfume, a scent that had haunted her dreams for 2 years. Reporters pressed forward, their microphones thrust toward Ava's face. How does it feel to be free? What message do you have for other wrongfully convicted youth? Will you pursue legal action? The questions came rapid fire, overwhelming her. Ava opened her mouth, but no words came. The world seemed to spin too fast, too loud, too bright after years of concrete and silence. Her father stepped forward protectively, shielding her from the barrage of questions. Through the chaos, she caught a glimpse of William Daniels and Jacob slipping out a side door, surrounded by security. Jacob's face was pale, his father's hand gripping his shoulder with brutal force as they ducked into a waiting black SUV. They vanished into traffic, leaving their crumbling empire behind. Ava watched them go, feeling neither victory nor hatred, just a hollow emptiness where her anger used to live. Hours later, Ava sat at her family's dining room table, staring at a plate of her mother's home-cooked food, mac and cheese, collard greens, fried chicken, all her old favorites. The familiar smells filled the kitchen, but her stomach felt tight. 2 years of institutional food had changed her. The portions looked too large, the colors too bright. She pushed the food around with her fork, trying to find her appetite. The clink of real silverware against the plate sounded strange after years of plastic utensils. The house was exactly as she remembered it, every picture frame and cushion in place, as if time had frozen while she was gone. But Ava wasn't the same girl who had left. The weight of that truth settled over her as she excused herself from the table, her food barely touched. Her mother's worried eyes followed her up the stairs, but no one tried to stop her. In her bedroom, everything waited exactly as she'd left it. Her art supplies still arranged on her desk, posters still hanging on the walls, stuffed animals still perched on her bed. The room smelled of lavender air freshener and childhood innocence. Ava picked up one of her old sketchbooks, running her fingers over the familiar cover. She flipped through pages of old drawings until she found a blank one, picked up a pencil, and held it over the empty white space. The drawings from before showed a different girl, one who still believed in fairness and justice. Her hand wouldn't move. 2 years of pain, fear, and injustice pressed down on her. The blank page stared back, waiting for her to make sense of it all. But where could she possibly begin? How could she capture on paper the way the system had stolen her youth, her trust, her very sense of self? The pencil trembled in her grip as tears began to fall, dotting the pristine white page. The call came early Monday morning. Elijah was in his home office reviewing case files of other wrongfully convicted youth when his phone buzzed. The stack of folders on his desk had grown taller each week as more families reached out for help. Jackson Reed's name flashed on the screen. "We found them," Jackson said without preamble. His voice carried a mix of satisfaction and urgency that made Elijah's heart race. "Got solid confirmation 20 minutes ago." Elijah's hand tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. "Where?" "Private airstrip outside Montreal. They're planning to board a flight to a non-extradition country tonight. William Daniels has connections in Venezuela. My contact says they've already transferred millions to offshore accounts." Within hours, the FBI surrounded the small airport, their vehicles strategically positioned at every exit. William and Jacob Daniels were caught as they attempted to board their private jet, their expensive luggage filled with cash and fake passports. The media captured every moment, father and son in handcuffs, their designer clothes wrinkled, their faces twisted with rage and fear. William's usual smug expression crumbled as the cameras flashed. In custody, Jacob Daniels cracked under the weight of his guilt and his father's betrayal. His confession came in broken sobs, the truth finally spilling out. He and Christopher had argued over a drug deal gone wrong in the school parking lot. Christopher had threatened to expose Jacob's role as a dealer to their parents, to destroy his perfect reputation. In a rage-filled moment, Jacob had grabbed the knife from his car and stabbed his best friend. His father, desperate to protect their family's reputation, orchestrated the entire cover-up, using their influence to frame an innocent black girl. He'd called in favors, threatened witnesses, and paid off officials without hesitation. The dominoes began to fall. Judge McAllister was removed from the bench, his decades of racist sentencing decisions exposed. The police officers who had fabricated evidence were fired and charged with corruption. The prison warden, faced with federal investigation into inmate abuse, resigned in disgrace. Each day brought new revelations, new arrests, new proof of how deep the corruption ran. Ava sat cross-legged on her living room couch watching the news coverage. The reporters detailed each arrest, each resignation, each new revelation of corruption. Her sketchbook lay open beside her, filled with drawings of the people who had wronged her now facing consequences. Camille sat beside her, their hands clasped tightly together, offering silent support. "Justice," Camille whispered as they watched William and Jacob Daniels being led into the federal courthouse, their heads bowed in shame. Ava released a long breath, feeling the weight of 2 years shift ever so slightly. It wasn't enough. Nothing could give her back the time she'd lost, the innocence that had been stolen. But it was a start, a first step toward healing. She squeezed her mother's hand, drawing strength from the warmth of home and family. A month after her release, Ava stood in front of her bedroom mirror, fingers tracing the soft cotton of her favorite blue sweater. Real clothes, no more orange jumpsuit, no more prison-issued shoes. Yet the reflection staring back felt like a stranger, someone caught between the innocent girl she'd been and the survivor she'd become. Despite her parents' strong objections, Ava insisted on visiting the juvenile detention center. The familiar smell of bleach and despair hit her as she walked through the security checkpoint. The same guards who had tormented her now avoided her gaze, their shoulders stiff with discomfort. But it wasn't them she came to see. In the visitation room, familiar faces brightened. Trina, who had once been her tormentor and later her protector, gave her a small nod of respect. Other girls crowded around, their eyes filled with hope at seeing one of their own make it out. Ms. Lorraine sat across from her at the metal table, her weathered hands clasped tightly. "They denied my parole again," she said softly, without bitterness. "Said I still haven't shown proper remorse for a crime I never committed." Ava reached across the table, gripping Ms. Lorraine's hands. "I won't leave you behind. I promise." The words carried the weight of determination that had kept her alive behind these walls. Within weeks, the Lorraine Foundation took shape. Elijah's legal connections merged with grassroots activists, creating a powerful force for change. Their mission was clear: fight for wrongfully convicted youth, starting with the woman who had saved Ava's life. Ms. Lorraine's case became their first priority. The interview request came from a major news network. Ava sat in the studio, lights hot on her face, the journalist leaning forward with practiced sympathy. The question hung in the air: "What do you want to say to the people who wronged you?" Ava took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 2 years of injustice, of fear, of rage. The world expected anger. They wanted her fury. Instead, she looked directly into the camera and said simply, "I forgive them." The journalist's mouth fell open slightly, her prepared follow-up questions forgotten in the face of such unexpected grace. 1 year after her release, Ava Johnson stood at a podium in a packed auditorium, her fingers resting on the glossy cover of her book, Chains and Choices: My Story of Injustice and Freedom. The crowd before her represented a tapestry of hope, parents clutching their children's hands, activists with well-worn notebooks, and teenagers who saw their own struggles reflected in her story. The biggest news had come just 2 days earlier. After 43 years behind bars, Ms. Lorraine walked free. The Lorraine Foundation's relentless legal campaign, combined with nationwide pressure, finally forced the parole board to acknowledge the truth. When they reunited outside the prison gates, no words were exchanged. Just a long, tight embrace that said everything words couldn't. Elijah Johnson surprised everyone by turning down President Mitchell's offer to lead a new federal commission on juvenile justice reform. "The system doesn't change from the inside," he explained at a press conference. "Real change happens when we fight from the outside." He joined Ava's foundation instead, bringing his legal expertise and connections to their growing movement. Despite acceptance letters from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, all offering full scholarships, Ava's path was clear. She would attend college, yes, but her real work was already underway. The Lorraine Foundation had grown into a powerful force with offices in 3 cities and a team of dedicated lawyers working pro bono for wrongfully convicted youth. As the line of people waiting for book signatures finally dwindled, a small boy approached Ava's table. He couldn't have been more than 12, clutching her book with trembling hands. His mother stood behind him, her eyes carrying that familiar weight of fear Ava knew too well. "He's facing charges," the mother whispered, her voice breaking, "for something he didn't do." Ava set down her pen and moved around the table. She knelt before the boy, meeting his frightened gaze with the steady strength she'd found in her own darkness. "You're gonna be okay," she told him, her voice firm with conviction. Because she knew. She was living proof that justice could win. If you enjoyed the story of Ava, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.